Growing up, I was the go-to babysitter for my little brother, Ethan. I was 5 years older than him, and by the time I turned 15, my parents trusted me enough to leave us alone on weekend nights. It was a small responsibility, but I didn't mind. Ethan was 7, an easy kid to watch. He'd plop in front of the TV, zone out to his cartoons, and I could do my own thing. It was a chilly October night in Salem, Massachusetts. One of those nights when the air feels heavier, like a storm's coming. My parents had a work party to attend and promised to be back by 10 p.m. "Lock the doors, don't open for anyone, and call us if there's an emergency," Mom said, kissing us both goodbye. I gave her my usual, "Got it, Mom," and waved them off. After heating up some frozen pizza for dinner, I set Ethan up with his favorite show in the living room. The house was quiet except for the muffled sound of the TV. I retreated to my room, plopped on my bed, and turned on my gaming console. About an hour passed, everything was normal. Then the doorbell rang. The sound jolted me. My parents never came home early without texting, and we weren't expecting anyone. I paused my game, my heart thudding in my chest. "Who's at the door?" Ethan called from the living room. "I don't know," I replied, keeping my voice steady. As I walked to the front door, I felt that weird, instinctual unease. Our house had a narrow window beside the door, just wide enough to peek through. I leaned over and saw a man standing on the porch. He was tall, maybe mid-40s, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. His face was lit by the porch light, and he had this odd smile. Polite, but off. When he noticed me looking, he waved, his hand moving slow and deliberate, like he wanted me to know he wasn't in a hurry. I cracked the door open, keeping the security screen locked. Can I help you?" "Hey there," he said, his voice smooth but overly casual. "Your parents home?" Something about the way he asked made my stomach twist. "Yeah, they're busy right now," I lied. He nodded, still smiling. "All right, no problem. Just wanted to check something. Thanks." He gave a small wave and walked off into the night. I watched him until he disappeared. Closing the door, I locked it tight and went back to the living room. Ethan was sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring at me. "Who was that?" he asked. "Just some guy," I said, trying to sound indifferent. But deep down, something about that encounter gnawed at me. An hour later, I was back in my room trying to focus on my game, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Ethan was still in the living room watching TV. Max, our Labrador, was sprawled out by the back door, asleep as usual. The house felt too quiet. Then Max started barking. I bolted upright. Max rarely barked unless there was a reason. I ran to the kitchen where he was standing by the sliding glass door, growling low and staring into the backyard. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, peeking out. The backyard was dark except for the faint glow of the neighbor's porch light. Nothing seemed out of place. Still, Max didn't stop growling, his fur bristling. I turned off the kitchen light to see better. That's when I noticed it. Movement near the fence. A shadow, quick and deliberate, slipping out of sight. My chest tightened. I locked the door and pulled the blinds, trying to convince myself it was just a raccoon or something. But deep down, I knew better. I went to check on Ethan. He was still on the floor, engrossed in his show. "Hey, Ethan, don't open the door for anyone, okay? Not even if they seem nice." He nodded, but his eyes didn't leave the screen. I ruffled his hair and went back to the kitchen to grab my phone. If something happened, I wanted to be ready. And then, it happened. The front door creaked open. My heart stopped. I had locked it. I knew I had. Dropping my phone, I sprinted to the living room. Ethan was standing by the door, looking up at the man from earlier. The guy was inside, crouched down and smiling at Ethan like they were old friends. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The man turned, his expression calm, almost amused. "Whoa, relax," he said, standing up slowly. "I was just talking to your little brother here. Get out of my house," I yelled, stepping between him and Ethan. The man held up his hands. All right, no need to freak out. I just wanted to show him something outside. You can come too if you want." Ethan moved toward him, but I grabbed his arm. "Stay behind me," I whispered. my voice shaking. The man's smile faded, his face hardened, his eyes narrowing. "You don't need to yell," he muttered, taking a step closer. "I already called the cops," I blurted out, even though I hadn't. "They'll be here any minute." His jaw tightened. For a moment, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and walked out the door without another word. I slammed it shut and locked it, every muscle in my body trembling. Ethan started crying, clinging to my side. "Why did he come back?" he sobbed. "I don't know," I admitted, holding him close. "But he's not coming back again. I won't let him." I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm, but mine was anything but. "There's a man trying to get into my house," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "He was inside, but I locked him out. Please send someone fast." The operator assured me help was on the way, but I couldn't relax. I led Ethan to my room and locked the door. Max was still barking in the kitchen, his growls echoing through the house. Then I heard it, a soft tap on the bedroom window. I froze. My bedroom was at the side of the house facing the driveway. Slowly, I turned off the lights and crept toward the window. The blinds were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of someone standing there. "Go away," I shouted, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. My hands fumbled for something, anything, to defend myself. I grabbed a lamp, ready to swing if it came to that. Then, the figure stepped back and disappeared into the shadows. I stayed by the window, barely breathing, until I heard the distant wail of sirens. The police arrived minutes later, but it felt like hours. I ran to the door and let them in, explaining everything as fast as I could. They searched the property and found footprints leading from the backyard to the side window, but the man was gone. One of the officers pulled up footage from a neighbor's security camera. It showed the man pacing near our house earlier that night, watching. The realization sent a shiver down my spine. He had been waiting, studying us, looking for the perfect moment. My parents arrived soon after, panicked and furious. Mom hugged us both so tight I could barely breathe, while Dad grilled the officers about how this could happen. They promised to patrol the neighborhood, but I knew it wouldn't erase what had already happened. Over the next few days, my parents installed extra locks, motion sensors, and security cameras. They even moved my room upstairs away from the windows, but no amount of precautions could erase the memory of that man's face or the way he smiled at Ethan like he already owned him. Even now, years later, I think about that night, about how close we came to something unthinkable. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that evil doesn't always come in shadows. Sometimes it stands on your porch, smiling. I still remember the day Lila walked through our door. Life had been chaotic ever since my wife and I moved to Salem, Massachusetts. Between juggling 2 full-time jobs and raising Alice, our 8-year-old daughter, and Ben, our 5-year-old son, we were completely burned out. Hiring a babysitter felt like the only way to save our sanity. Lila seemed perfect. She came highly recommended by a trusted agency. Her references were glowing, and she had this calm, soft-spoken demeanor that made you instantly feel at ease. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with these big, kind eyes and an easy smile that the kids immediately warmed up to. Alice called her Nanny Lila from the moment she arrived, and Ben followed her around like a little shadow. At first, everything was great. Lila was attentive, playful, and handled the kids with a natural ease that made me question why we hadn't hired her sooner. For the first time in months, my wife and I felt like we could breathe again, but then small things started to feel off. It began with little moments that didn't make sense. One night I came home from work and found Alice sitting in the living room, completely still, staring at the corner of the room. "Alice, what are you doing?" I asked. No response. I called her again, louder this time, and she snapped out of it, blinking like she'd just woken up from a dream. Before I could press further, Lila appeared, gliding into the room like she'd been watching the whole thing. "She's fine," she said, in that calm, soothing tone of hers. "She just had a long day." Her words made sense, but something about the way she spoke didn't. It was almost rehearsed. That night, as I sat on the couch scrolling through my phone, I couldn't shake the image of Alice staring at the wall. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Kids do weird things all the time. But the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. Over the next few days, the uneasy feeling only grew stronger. I started noticing objects in strange places around the house. A black candle appeared on the kitchen counter one morning. I didn't buy it, and when I asked my wife, she swore she hadn't either. Lila shrugged it off when I brought it up. "Maybe the kids found it and thought it was cool," she said with a laugh. It felt like a reasonable explanation, but then it happened again. Symbols started showing up too. At first, it was small drawings on scraps of paper, circles with strange lines cutting through them. I found one tucked into Alice's backpack and another stuffed under the couch cushions. When I asked the kids about it, Alice just shrugged, saying she didn't remember drawing anything like that. Ben, who was usually so talkative, avoided the question entirely. One night, things escalated. I woke up to a soft humming sound coming from Alice's room. When I opened the door, my heart stopped. Alice was sitting on the floor, her back to me, humming a low, unfamiliar tune. In her hands was a piece of chalk, and she was drawing one of those symbols on the hardwood floor. "Alice!" I called out, louder than I intended. She froze, then turned to look at me with glassy, distant eyes. "What are you doing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She dropped the chalk and crawled back into bed like nothing had happened. The next morning, I asked Lila if Alice had been acting strange lately. She gave me that same calm smile. "Kids have wild imaginations," she said. I wouldn't worry about it, but I couldn't ignore the way her eyes lingered on mine, as if she knew something I didn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the image of Alice drawing that symbol on the floor. Something was wrong, and I couldn't just brush it off anymore. While the house was quiet, I decided to do some digging. I started with Lila's room. Her door was locked, but I had a spare key. I hesitated for a moment before turning it. Inside, everything looked too neat, like a staged hotel room. There were no personal items, no photos, no books, nothing to suggest someone actually lived there, except for a small leather bag sitting on the nightstand. When I opened it, my stomach turned. Inside were several black candles, small pouches filled with dried herbs, and a strange-looking knife with symbols etched into the blade. But what truly unsettled me was a small, battered notebook buried at the bottom of the bag. The cover was worn, and the pages inside were filled with scribbled symbols and drawings, symbols like the ones Alice had been drawing. As I flipped through, my blood ran cold. There were crude sketches of two children, surrounded by the same strange markings, and beneath one of the drawings were the names Alice and Ben, written in shaky, uneven handwriting. My hands were trembling as I carried the notebook to my wife. She stared at it in disbelief, her face pale. "This is insane," she whispered. "We need to confront her." When Lila returned that afternoon, I couldn't hold back. I placed the notebook on the table in front of her and demanded an explanation. She didn't even flinch. Her calm demeanor was unnerving. "I don't know what you think this is," she said, her voice steady. "But I assure you, it's nothing to be worried about. The kids must have found it somewhere and decided to play with it." Her words were smooth, almost too smooth. My wife and I exchanged a look. Lila knew we didn't believe her, but she didn't seem the least bit concerned. That was what scared me the most. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, sitting in the living room, listening for any sound. Around midnight, I heard something faint, like a soft scraping noise, coming from the basement. My heart started pounding. I grabbed my phone for light and quietly made my way downstairs. The scene that greeted me will haunt me for the rest of my life. Lila was kneeling in the middle of the basement floor, surrounded by lit black candles. Alice and Ben were sitting on either side of her, their eyes vacant, their faces blank. Between them was a large symbol drawn on the floor in what looked like blood. "Lila!" I shouted, my voice echoing in the small space. She turned to look at me, and for the first time, her calm mask cracked. Her eyes were wild, her face twisted in frustration. "You shouldn't be here," she hissed, her voice low and sharp. "You're ruining everything." I ran toward Alice, but before I could reach her, Lila stood and pushed me back. Her strength was inhuman, like she was fueled by something far beyond her small frame. I hit the ground hard, my head spinning. Behind me, I heard the sound of my wife screaming from upstairs. I had called her earlier, asking her to stay alert, and thank God she had the sense to call the police. The sound of sirens in the distance made Lila freeze. She blew out the candles in one swift motion and grabbed a cloth from the floor, covering the symbol. Before I could react, she bolted up the stairs and out the back door. I scrambled to my feet and grabbed Alice and Ben, shaking them gently. "We need to go," I said, my voice breaking. They didn't respond at first, but after a moment, Alice blinked and looked up at me. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice weak. I pulled both of them close and led them upstairs just as the police burst through the front door. The hours after Lila vanished were a blur. The police swarmed the house asking endless questions, but I didn't have answers for most of them. Alice and Ben clung to me, too shaken to say much. My wife was pale, her hands trembling as she tried to explain what we had found in the basement. It sounded insane, even to me, and I had seen it with my own eyes. The police found the remnants of the ritual, bloodstains on the floor, half-melted black candles, and traces of the strange herbs Lila had been using. They bagged the notebook and the knife I'd found in her room as evidence. One of the officers, an older man with a hard face, pulled me aside. "This isn't the first time we've seen something like this," he said quietly. "There have been reports in neighboring towns of similar rituals, kids involved. But we've never caught anyone in the act." That didn't make me feel any better. Lila was gone, and with her, any clear understanding of what she had been trying to do. The thought of her out there walking free chilled me to the bone. Later that day, a neighbor, Mr. Peterson, knocked on our door. He was a quiet, reclusive man who rarely spoke to anyone, but now he seemed anxious, almost guilty. "I don't want to get involved," he started, "but I've seen her sneaking around your house at night, carrying things. I thought it was odd, but I didn't want to assume the worst." His words sent a wave of anger and regret through me. If he had spoken up sooner, maybe none of this would have happened. That night, as I watched my kids sleep, I made a decision. We couldn't stay in this house or this town. Salem, once a quiet escape for us, had turned into a place of nightmares. Whatever peace we thought we'd find here was gone. We packed up and left Salem within a week. It was fast, almost too fast, but I didn't care. We rented a small apartment in Boston, far enough to feel like we'd put some distance between us and what had happened. I didn't even bother selling the house. I just wanted to leave it all behind. Alice and Ben started therapy immediately. Alice opened up quickly, sharing bits and pieces of what she remembered. She said she wanted to help us, Alice told her therapist one day. She said we needed to be protected. Her words sent shivers down my spine. Protected from what? Or worse, by what? Ben, on the other hand, was quieter. He barely spoke at all in the first few weeks after we moved. But at night, he would wake up screaming, his small voice echoing through the apartment. "She's here, she's watching me," he'd cry, tears streaming down his face. Each time I'd hold him tightly, whispering that he was safe, even though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. As for me, the guilt was the hardest part to deal with. How had I not seen the signs sooner? How had I let this happen to my family? The questions kept me awake at night, replaying every little thing Lila had done, every moment I'd dismissed as just a little odd. One day, Alice asked me something that stopped me in my tracks. "Dad, do you think Lila will come back?" I didn't know what to say at first. I wanted to lie, to tell her no, that Lila was gone forever, but instead I knelt down and looked her in the eyes. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but if she does, we'll be ready." Today, I'm sharing this story because I want people to know. Not all monsters hide in the dark. Some of them walk into your home with a smile, earning your trust before they reveal their true nature. If something doesn't feel right, trust your gut. I wish I had. As for Lila, she was never found, and maybe that's for the best. Whatever she was trying to do, she didn't succeed. But sometimes when the nights are quiet and the apartment is still, I find myself wondering, what if she tries again? And what if the next family isn't so lucky? I never thought babysitting could turn into the most terrifying night of my life. It started like any other gig. I needed the extra cash to cover some college expenses, so when the Thompsons offered me the job, I jumped at it. They lived in one of those massive houses in a quiet Denver suburb, the kind of place with spotless lawns and neighbors who wave but don't really know your name. When I got there, Mrs. Thompson greeted me with a warm smile. She walked me through the basics, where the baby's room was, the bottles in the fridge, how to use the monitor, standard babysitting stuff. "Here's the house phone," she said, pointing to an old-looking landline on the kitchen counter. "We hardly use it, but just in case your cell loses signal." The baby, Emma, was already asleep upstairs, which made my job pretty easy. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. As they were heading out, Mr. Thompson reminded me about the security system. "Doors and windows are locked, but if anything feels off, just call us or 911, okay?" I laughed it off. "Got it, have fun." The house had that eerie calm you only notice when you're alone. I settled into the couch with some homework, feeling a little weird in such a big empty space, but nothing I couldn't handle. At least that's what I thought. It must have been around 9 p.m. when the first call came. I didn't even think twice about it, probably a wrong number. But when I answered, there was a pause. Not the kind of pause where someone's fumbling to speak, but the kind where you know someone's there, listening. "Hello?" I said, a little annoyed. Nothing. Just silence. Then a click. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was nothing. I went back to my homework, but the silence in the house felt heavier now, like the walls were closing in. About 20 minutes later, the phone rang again. This time I hesitated before answering. "Hello," I said, trying to sound confident. A low voice came through, barely above a whisper. "Are you alone?" Chills ran down my spine. I froze, my hand gripping the phone so tight my knuckles turned white. I didn't answer. The line went dead before I could even process what had just happened. I stood there, staring at the phone, my heart pounding in my ears. Was it a prank? Some bored kid messing around? Either way, it didn't sit right with me. I checked the baby monitor. Emma was still sound asleep. I locked the front door, again, just to be sure. That's when I noticed the kitchen window was slightly open. That window. I swear it had been closed when the Thompsons left. My stomach turned as I walked over to it, my hands shaking. I locked it tight and checked the latch 3 times. I told myself maybe I just didn't notice it before, or maybe they forgot to mention it. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I started going through the house, making sure every single door and window was locked. It felt like the right thing to do, even if I was overreacting. The baby monitor sat on the coffee table, and I kept glancing at it to make sure Emma was okay. The little green light blinked steadily. She was still fast asleep. Then the phone rang again. I jumped so hard I almost knocked over a lamp. My breath hitched as I stared at the screen. Unknown caller. My gut told me not to answer, but my hand moved before I could stop it. "Hello?" I said, my voice trembling. There was a long pause, and then the same low voice came through. "Why did you lock the window?" I froze. My blood turned to ice. They were watching me. I spun around, my eyes darting to every shadow, every corner of the room. The curtains were drawn. How could they see? I slammed the phone down and grabbed my cell. My fingers fumbled as I tried to call the Thompsons, but it went straight to voicemail. Of course it did. Why wouldn't it? I couldn't sit still. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside felt like a threat. I knew I needed to call the police, but what was I gonna say? "Hi, I think someone's watching me, but I don't know how or where." They'd think I was nuts. Then I heard it. A faint sound. A soft creak coming from upstairs. Emma. I grabbed the baby monitor, staring at the screen like my life depended on it. The camera showed the crib, the mobile above it spinning slowly. She was still asleep, thank God. But something felt off. It was too dark in the corner of the room, like the shadows were heavier there. My stomach churned as I climbed the stairs step by agonizing step. My hands were clammy, and I clutched my phone like a lifeline. When I reached Emma's door, I hesitated. What if someone was in there? I pushed the door open, my heart pounding in my throat. Emma stirred but stayed asleep. The room was empty, or at least it looked that way. I checked the closet, under the crib, even behind the curtains. Nothing. No one. Then I saw it. The phone. The old landline phone, sitting on a small table in the hallway just outside the baby's room. My heart sank. It was off the hook. That phone being off the hook felt like a slap to the face. I didn't touch it. I didn't even go near it earlier. Someone had to be here. My hands were trembling as I hung it back up, trying to stay as quiet as possible. My mind raced. If the calls were coming from this house, then someone was already inside. I grabbed Emma from the crib. She whimpered but didn't fully wake up. I pressed her to my chest, whispering, "It's okay, baby. We're okay." But I wasn't okay. I was scared out of my mind. Clutching her, I crept downstairs and locked us in the first-floor bathroom. My breathing was shallow and my ears strained to pick up even the slightest noise. I held my phone and dialed 911. The operator answered and I whispered, "Someone's in the house. I'm babysitting and they've been calling me. The calls, they're coming from the house phone." Her voice was calm, too calm for what I was feeling. She asked me for the address and I gave it to her in a rush. "Stay on the line," she said. "Officers are on their way." Then I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps coming from the hallway. My heart nearly stopped. I pressed my hand over Emma's mouth to keep her from making a sound. The footsteps got closer, pausing just outside the bathroom door. I didn't even breathe. The doorknob jiggled once, twice, and then stopped. Whoever it was, they knew I was in there. Minutes felt like hours. I stayed frozen, my back pressed against the cold tile. Emma stirred in my arms, and I silently prayed she wouldn't cry. The footsteps moved away, fading down the hall. My whole body was shaking, but I knew I couldn't stay there forever. The sound of a door creaking open somewhere in the house jolted me into action. It was the basement door. I cracked the bathroom door open just enough to peek out. The hallway was empty. I crept out, clutching Emma and trying to move as silently as possible. My heart pounded so hard it felt like the intruder could hear it. I made my way to the kitchen where I could see the front door. I was so close. Then I heard it again. The low, deliberate creak of the basement stairs. Someone was coming up. I bolted for the front door, throwing caution to the wind. My fingers fumbled with the locks, and just as I got the door open, I heard a voice behind me. "Where are you going?" I didn't look back. I ran, Emma clinging to me, her small cries breaking through the night. I sprinted down the driveway and into the street, praying the cops would get there in time. And then I saw them, flashing red and blue lights rounding the corner, heading straight for me. Relief washed over me so hard, I almost collapsed right there. But I didn't stop running until I was safely behind the officers. I stood there clutching Emma as the officers rushed into the house. My legs felt like jelly, and my breath came in short gasps. The baby was crying now, her small fists gripping my shirt like she knew something was wrong. The officers moved quickly, their flashlights slicing through the darkness of the house. One stayed with me, asking questions I could barely answer. "There's someone inside," I managed to say, my voice shaking. "They were in the basement. They called me from the house phone." The officer nodded, his hand hovering over his gun. "Stay here, we'll handle it." I watched as they disappeared into the house, their voices echoing through the halls. For a moment, everything was still. Too still. Then a loud crash came from inside, followed by shouting. The officer with me ran toward the noise, leaving me alone with Emma on the front lawn. My heart was in my throat as I clutched her tighter, staring at the house. Minutes later, they dragged him out. The man wasn't what I expected. He wasn't some towering monster or a shadowy figure from a horror movie. He was just a man. Average height, messy hair, clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. But his eyes, those cold, empty eyes, sent a shiver down my spine. He's been living in the basement, one of the officers told me later. Looks like he's been squatting here for a while, probably snuck in when the Thompsons were out. Living in the basement. All those nights the family thought they were alone. He was there, watching, listening. The officer handed me a blanket, and I finally let Emma go when another officer took her gently from my arms. I collapsed onto the curb, the weight of everything crashing down on me. As the adrenaline wore off, the reality of it all set in. This wasn't some random prank or a creepy coincidence, it was real. It happened. And if I hadn't acted when I did, I don't even want to think about what could have happened to me, or to Emma. I never babysat again after that night. I couldn't. Every creak in my apartment, every ring of my phone brought it all back. The Thompsons were grateful, of course. They even offered me money to make up for the trauma, but I declined. I didn't need their money. I just needed to forget. But some things you can't forget. Like the sound of that voice on the phone, or the thought of those cold eyes watching me from the dark. It was a chilly Saturday evening in Seattle, and I had just finished my part-time shift when my phone buzzed with a last-minute job notification. Babysitting was my side hustle, something flexible to fill the gaps between my other gigs. This one seemed perfect. 2 boys, ages 6 and 5, from 8 p.m. to 1 a.m. in Queen Anne Hill, one of Seattle's oldest neighborhoods. Late-night jobs like these were my favorite. Most of the time, the kids went to bed early, and I had hours to myself. Easy money. The address was for a Victorian-style house I didn't recognize, but the neighborhood was safe. The parents, Rachel and Tom, were polite but rushed when I arrived. They looked a bit frazzled, but who wouldn't be with 2 young kids? Rachel handed me a handwritten list of instructions. Charlie and Ben should be in bed by 9:30, she said, glancing nervously at her husband. And one thing, don't go into the attic. It's locked, but just in case, don't. She laughed awkwardly, but it felt more like a warning than a joke. I met the boys, who were shy but sweet. They were huddled on the couch watching cartoons. After their parents left, I settled in, following the routine Rachel had outlined. Everything seemed normal, though the house had a strange vibe. Too quiet, with floorboards that groaned under every step. Still, I told myself it was just an old house. The boys went to bed without a fuss at 9:30. As I tucked them in, Charlie mentioned something strange. "Sometimes the tall man watches us," he whispered, eyes darting toward the door. "Who's the tall man?" I asked, my stomach tightening. He shrugged. "He stands in the hallway at night." I dismissed it as a child's imagination, though his words left me uneasy. After checking to make sure both boys were asleep, I headed back downstairs. I made myself comfortable on the couch, scrolling through my phone and enjoying the silence. Around 11 p.m., I started feeling sleepy. I paused my video and went to the kitchen for water. That's when I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper of my name. I froze. The boys were upstairs, sound asleep, or so I thought. Shaking it off, I returned to the couch, telling myself it was just the house settling. But then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming from the hallway upstairs. I shot up, my pulse racing. The sound wasn't subtle anymore, it was distinct, each step heavy and deliberate. My first thought was the boys. I grabbed my phone, using the flashlight as I hurried up the stairs. When I peeked into the boys' room, Charlie was awake, sitting up in bed with wide, terrified eyes. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "He's outside," Charlie said, clutching his blanket. "The tall man." I stepped into the hallway, my heart pounding. The air felt colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally. but there was no one there. I checked every room, including the locked attic door, which now had a faint, almost imperceptible hum coming from behind it. After calming Charlie down, I tucked him back into bed and returned to the couch. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The house's creaks and groans felt more intentional, like they were alive. As I sat on the couch, I kept glancing at the staircase. It felt like something was waiting up there, just out of sight. I tried to distract myself with videos, but every few minutes I'd hear faint footsteps or soft whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. At around midnight, the sound changed. It was no longer subtle. A loud thud echoed from the attic, followed by the unmistakable sound of something dragging across the floor. My stomach twisted in knots. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen, my only sense of security, and made my way upstairs. The attic door was no longer fully shut. It was slightly ajar, and a cold draft seeped through the crack. My instincts screamed to stay away, but I couldn't ignore it. I inched closer, the hum from before now louder, vibrating through the wood. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The dragging stopped. I pushed the attic door open and stepped inside. The room was pitch black except for a faint glow coming from a large antique mirror propped against the far wall. The air was icy and the smell of mildew was overpowering. As I moved closer to the mirror, I noticed my reflection didn't look right. My movements didn't match what I was doing. It was delayed, as if the reflection was watching me rather than mirroring me. Then I saw him. A tall, shadowy figure stood behind me in the reflection, his glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. I spun around, knife in hand, but the room was empty. My reflection, however, stayed frozen, staring at me with an eerie smile. Terrified, I slammed the attic door shut and bolted downstairs, locking the boys' bedroom door and sitting with them. Charlie whispered, "You saw him, didn't you?" Before I could answer, the dragging sound returned, this time louder, as if it was right above us. Ben whimpered, clinging to my arm. "We have to go," I said, my voice shaking. I grabbed the boys and headed for the front door, but it wouldn't open. The lock turned, but it felt like the door was bolted shut from the outside. Panic set in as the dragging sound moved to the staircase. We ran to the kitchen, looking for another way out, but every window was sealed tight. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. My phone's flashlight was the only source of light as I led the boys into the bathroom and locked the door. The whispers started again, louder and more insistent. "You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be here." The voice seemed to come from the walls themselves, surrounding us. The bathroom door rattled violently, and the whispers grew into a deafening roar. I held the boys close, whispering reassurances I didn't believe. Then, everything stopped. Silence. A single knock echoed on the door, slow and deliberate. I opened it a crack, expecting to see the tall man, but the hallway was empty. The whispers started again, but this time they weren't angry. They were pleading. "Help us, set us free." I realized the voices weren't just one entity. They were many, trapped and begging for release. The attic. It had to be the key. Grabbing the boys, I raced upstairs. The attic door swung open on its own as we approached. Inside, the mirror glowed brighter, and the shadowy figure stood before it motionless. The whispers grew louder as I stepped closer to the mirror. The tall man didn't move, but his presence was suffocating. I could feel the weight of the souls trapped in the house. Instinctively, I hurled the knife at the mirror. It shattered into 1,000 shards, and a deafening scream filled the room. The tall man disintegrated into smoke, and the room grew silent. The boys and I ran downstairs, and the front door now opened easily. We bolted outside just as the police arrived, their sirens piercing the night. Inside, they found no signs of anyone or anything, but they couldn't explain the shattered mirror or the icy chill that lingered in the air. I never babysat again after that night. Months later, I found an article about Ashford House. It had been abandoned for years before Rachel and Tom bought it, and before that, it was owned by a man accused of horrific crimes. They never found his victims, but I think I know where their souls ended up. And to this day, I can't look at a mirror without wondering if he's still watching. was sitting on the couch, arms crossed and sulking like my life depended on it. My mom walked into the living room, dragging along the babysitter they just hired. Babysitter. Seriously? I'm 12 years old. I don't need some stranger looking over my shoulder all night. But my parents were dead set on it. "This is Kyle," Mom said with that fake cheerful voice she uses when she's trying to make me behave. Standing next to her was a skinny, nerdy-looking guy with glasses. He looked just as uncomfortable as I felt. "Hi, you must be Evan," Kyle said, smiling nervously. His voice was as awkward as his appearance. I glared at my mom. "Really? Him? He looks useless." "Evan, apologize," Mom snapped. "Fine. Sorry, Kyle," I muttered, rolling my eyes. Kyle just gave me a weird, forced smile while Mom started listing all the rules for him. "There's money for pizza on the counter and plenty of snacks in the fridge," she said. "Oh, and Evan loves scary movies, but don't let him stay up too late, okay?" "Yes, ma'am," Kyle said, nodding like some kind of obedient puppy. "Evan, behave yourself," Mom warned, giving me her famous "don't test me" look. Then she grabbed her purse and left with Dad. As soon as the door closed, Kyle sat down awkwardly on the couch next to me. "So, scary movies, huh? You like those?" "Yeah," I said, smirking. "Do you?" "Sure," he said, but his voice cracked just a little. I grinned. "Cool. Let's watch something really scary." I grabbed the remote and put on The Mystery of the Bloody Mansion. It's the kind of movie that isn't just scary, it's messed up. Blood everywhere, creepy music, the whole deal. Perfect. 10 minutes in, Kyle's face was pale as a ghost. He tried to act cool, but I could see his hands shaking every time he reached for his soda. I couldn't stop laughing inside. "You know," I said, "we could always play a game if the movie's too much for you." Kyle's voice wavered. "No, it's fine, I'm good." But then the doorbell rang. Kyle practically jumped out of his skin. "Oh, I'll get that," he stammered, bolting to the door. I watched him peek through the window. His face went pale again. "Who is it?" I asked. "No one's there," he said, his voice shaky. "Maybe it was just kids messing around?" I snorted. "Or maybe it's a ghost, like in the movie." "Very funny," he muttered, locking the door. This guy was a total coward. I knew I had to mess with him more. "How about a game of hide and seek?" I suggested. He hesitated but finally nodded. "Sure, sounds fun." Kyle smiled nervously, clearly relieved he wouldn't have to sit through more of the movie. "You hide first," I said. "All right," he replied, glancing around like a lost puppy. I counted to 20, then found him in about 5 minutes. The idiot was hiding under the kitchen table. "Really? That's the best you could do?" I teased. He laughed awkwardly. "The basement's too dark. Not really my thing." That gave me the perfect idea. "Okay, my turn," I said. "But we're making it harder now. Lights off." Kyle hesitated. Are you sure? It's pretty dark." "Come on," I said, smirking. "It'll be more fun." "All right," he sighed, trying to sound brave. As he turned to count, I grabbed the TV remote and crept behind the kitchen counter. When Kyle finished counting and started looking for me, I waited until he got close to the TV and then blasted the volume as loud as it would go. The sudden scream from the movie soundtrack made Kyle jump about 3 feet in the air. He scrambled to turn it off, his hands shaking so badly it took him a couple of tries. "Not funny, Evan," he shouted, his voice cracking. I was doubled over laughing. "You're such a wimp." Kyle glared at me but didn't say anything. He just muttered something about pizza and headed to the kitchen to grab his phone. While he called in an order for a pepperoni pizza, I sat there, still grinning. That's when another idea hit me. Something even better than the TV scare. Hide and seek was about to get a whole lot scarier. While Kyle was in the kitchen finishing the pizza order, I hatched my next plan. If he was freaked out by a movie and some loud noises, imagine how scared he'd get during a real hide and seek scare. As soon as he came back to the living room, I smiled innocently. All right, let's play another round. You count, I'll hide. Kyle looked relieved. Fine. Just don't do anything stupid this time. He turned to the wall and started counting. 1, 2, 3. I tiptoed out of the room, heading upstairs to my parents' bedroom. I figured the best place to hide would be their walk-in closet. It was big, dark, and perfect for my plan. I slipped inside and pulled the door shut behind me. It was quiet except for the faint sound of Kyle's muffled counting downstairs. The moonlight streaming through the bedroom window cast a dim glow into the closet, just enough to see. And that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a pile of clothes someone had left. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it wasn't clothes. It was a person, a boy, maybe a few years older than me, lying on the closet floor. His head was wrapped in a plastic bag, and his body was completely still. My heart stopped. My stomach churned, and I felt like I was going to throw up. Who was this? I leaned closer, trembling, and saw a wallet sticking out of his shirt pocket. With shaking hands, I pulled it out and flipped it open. There was an ID inside. Joshua Miller. I froze. Joshua was the name of the babysitter my parents had hired, the one who was supposed to be here tonight. If Joshua was dead, who was the guy downstairs? Panic hit me like a truck. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to crawl under my parents' bed, trying to stay as quiet as possible. A moment later, I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. "Evan?" Kyle's voice called out, almost sing-song. "You didn't go into your parents' room, did you?" The footsteps got closer. I clamped a hand over my mouth, trying to stop the sound of my heavy breathing. From under the bed, I could see Kyle's legs enter the room. He stopped right in front of the open closet door. "Congratulations," he said, his tone shifting to something cold and unnatural. "You found your babysitter." And then he laughed. I was frozen under the bed, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Kyle started talking, his voice casual like we were old friends. "You know," he said, stepping into the closet, "Joshua used to be my best friend, until he decided to hook up with my girlfriend." I could hear him moving things around in the closet like he was checking the body. "I mean, come on," he continued, his tone dark and twisted. "Joshua? Really? That guy couldn't even handle watching scary movies. What kind of loser steals someone's girlfriend?" He laughed bitterly. "So yeah, I did what I had to do. Followed him here, waited for him to show up, and, well, you can see how that turned out." My chest tightened as I realized the full extent of what was happening. This guy had killed Joshua, in my house, and now he was here, talking like I was next on his list. Kyle stepped back into the room, pacing. "I didn't mean for you to get involved, you know. This was supposed to be quick and clean. Get rid of him, babysit you for a few hours, and leave before anyone noticed." He stopped pacing and sat down on the bed, his feet dangling inches from my face. "But then you had to start poking around," he said, his voice dripping with annoyance. "Now I've got to figure out what to do with you." My mind raced. I couldn't stay under the bed forever. Sooner or later he'd find me. "All right," Kyle said, standing up suddenly. "Let's make this simple. I'll count to 10, and if you come out, maybe I'll go easy on you." He started counting. 1, 2, 3. I didn't wait for him to finish. As quietly as I could, I slid out from under the bed on the other side and bolted for the door. "Hey!" Kyle shouted, but I didn't look back. I ran down the hallway and into the bathroom, slamming the door shut and locking it just as he reached it. "You think that'll stop me?" he yelled, pounding on the door. I backed away, my hands shaking. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything I could use to defend myself. A towel rack? Too flimsy? A toothbrush? Useless. Then I remembered the pizza delivery guy. The doorbell had rung earlier. What if he came back? I ran to the bathroom window and peered outside, hoping against hope that I'd see someone. Anyone. I stayed at the window, straining my eyes in the dark, praying the pizza delivery guy would still be outside. But the street was empty, just shadows and the faint glow of the porch light. "Come on, Evan." Kyle banged on the door again. "You're making this harder than it has to be." My mind raced. I had to get out of the bathroom, but how? The window was too small to squeeze through, and Kyle was right outside the door. Then I heard it, the doorbell. I froze. Did Kyle hear it too? "Guess we've got company," Kyle said, his voice dripping with menace. "Don't go anywhere." I heard his footsteps retreating down the hallway. He was going to the front door. This was my chance. I opened the bathroom door as quietly as I could and crept down the hallway. From the top of the stairs, I could see Kyle standing at the front door, knife in hand. The pizza delivery guy was on the other side of the door, oblivious to the danger. "Hey, open up!" the delivery guy called. Kyle hesitated, probably deciding whether to play it cool or just attack. That's when I shouted at the top of my lungs, "Help! He has a knife! Call the police!" The delivery guy froze, and for a moment, so did Kyle. Then everything happened at once. Kyle yanked the door open and lunged at the delivery guy. But the guy wasn't some skinny teenager. He was big, maybe in his mid-20s, and he wasn't going down without a fight. They struggled at the doorway, Kyle swinging the knife wildly. I couldn't just stand there. I ran down the stairs, grabbing the first thing I could find, a heavy lamp from the side table. "Hey, psycho!" I shouted. Kyle turned just as I smashed the lamp over his head. He stumbled, dropping the knife, and the delivery guy tackled him to the ground. Together, we managed to pin him down. The delivery guy twisted Kyle's arm behind his back while I kicked the knife away. "Call the cops, kid," the delivery guy yelled. I grabbed Kyle's phone from the counter and dialed 911, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. "They're on their way," I said, my voice trembling. Kyle thrashed on the ground, but the delivery guy held him tight until the police arrived. The red and blue lights lit up the quiet street as two cops burst through the door, guns drawn. "He's on the floor," I yelled, pointing at Kyle. The officers cuffed him while he screamed and cursed, spitting out threats about how he'd finish the job one day. As the cops dragged him away, one of them asked me, "You okay, kid?" I nodded, but my legs felt like jelly. I wasn't okay, not even close. My parents showed up about an hour later, tears streaming down my mom's face. She hugged me so tight I thought I'd suffocate. "Oh my God, Evan," she sobbed. "We're so sorry." My dad talked to the cops while my mom stayed glued to my side. They told us Kyle had come prepared. His bag was full of rope, duct tape, sleeping pills, and extra plastic bags. His plan had been to drug me with the pizza, dispose of Joshua's body, and make it look like nothing ever happened. The delivery guy was hailed as a hero. My dad gave him a fat stack of cash, calling it a thank you for saving my son's life. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Kyle's twisted smile or the lifeless face of Joshua in the closet. From then on, my parents never left me with a babysitter again. They'd drop me off at my grandma's house or cancel their plans altogether. But even now, years later, I can't hear a doorbell without my stomach twisting in knots, because I know what it's like to open the door and find something waiting that you'll never forget.